right. Just checking some stuff over there. See how many people we got in. We got 6 people in at the moment. We can give everyone a couple more seconds. I think I figured out what the technical issue was last time. My computer had a power surge, which apparently shorted out my USB ports, which I was using for my mic as well as my phone. So, yeah, so hopefully that's been fixed. At the very least, the USB ports have been fixed. That took the better part of a couple hours to solve. But once that was solved, that was solved. Let me just delete things over here just to make sure. I was just checking some stuff in terms of policies. So, should be on lower latency than today than we were the other day. So the delay should be lower. Let me put the link to everything. Morning, Ethan. Let me put the link to the YouTube stream onto Canvas while I'm thinking about it while I got everything going. Anyone having stuttering issues? That's possible to be on my end. I did do an option with less latency than normal, or less latency than last time, so that could be on my end. OBS says it's decent. Okay, so it might just be on Chandler there. Hopefully that kind of smooths out for you, Chandler, as we go along. Seems okay now. Good. Phone plugged in. Phone is plugged in. It was plugged in last time too. The issue last time, apparently what happened was, so I have my phone plugged in so I can stream the video data into my computer directly, as well as my audio data directly into the computer. And there was a power surge in my device or something like that happened. I don't know what, but it shorted out the USB ports on my computer. And fortunately nothing too serious. I just had to reinstall the drivers, so that solved that. But yeah, that's why I Thanos'd out. Michael actually showed me the video on Twitter of how it looked like when I just faded out to black, and it was actually really funny. I couldn't have scripted that better myself, and I was like, oh no. Like I don't know. I thought that was pretty funny. Let me just go put the link for today into Canvas. The announcements real quick. Class link for March. It's going to change the camera. I don't want to change the camera to 7. March 27th. So there we go. There's the YouTube link there. Save that. The attendance doc still says 325. Is that okay? Yeah, no, that's fine. I have it as a separate thing. Thank you for letting me know that. Let me just change the wording on that live. Let me just fix that up. Yeah, no, it's totally fine. Thank you for letting me know, Madeline. I just fixed that up. All right. How are we all doing today? How is our Friday going? Let me move the pop-out chat over closer to the camera so it doesn't look like I'm off to the side. All right, we got 21 people in so far, which is probably about as good a time as any. Just is the chat frozen on my end? It could be. What are we supposed to read for next week? So, excellent question, Chandler. Thank you for asking. So, I originally was going to have you guys read a article version of the chapter for my. So the syllabus should have. Let me open it up on screen just to make sure. The syllabus should have, for next week, you have a textbook chapter reading. I'm sorry, let me actually do it so you can see both. So next week for the syllabus, you should have textbook chapter reading. I added the frenemies Bit by Settle on Canvas. As a reminder, we do have still the final essay. If you guys want me to give you guys a read over of the final essay before you submit it, please submit that to me by next Wednesday. I can give that essay a final read over, a good read over, to see if you guys are on the right track in terms of the longer final paper. Essay still due tonight, as correct? Yes, the essay for tonight is still due at midnight tonight. In general, I'm being, I guess I mentioned before at the very beginning of the class, I'm not the kind of person who's going to be a stickler about 1 or 2 minutes or anything else like that. I'm obviously going to be a little less of a stickler right now due to everything going on, internet connection issues and all those other sorts of things. So please, if you can get it in tonight, get it in tonight. But if it takes you till tomorrow, then I'm not going to take I'm not going to take points off. But yes, the essay is still due tonight. So you have the frenemies, and then I was going to give you guys one of my papers. I was going to give you guys a paper version of the chapter that I'm working on in my dissertation right now. So the article version of that. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to write article versions of things when you have both a baby and a pandemic going on. So it's like that is not. This is not what you guys will be. Well, you guys will be getting this, but you're gonna get a far earlier version of this. Having trouble hearing. Is everyone else hearing me all right then? Am I coming through okay? Or is it just a connection issue there? I can raise the volume on the input. My coffee. You sound good. All right. Okay. Cool. Just making sure. All right. Awesome. Glad to hear. Daniela, I think I owe you an email. So I'll be sending you one in a little bit after class. It's all fixed up. Okay, good. Excellent. Glad to see. Okay, glad to see that it's all working out. Just wanted to make sure, because I'm a little paranoid after last time when I, again, Thanos'd out midway through the stream. So you guys will be getting a far earlier and far less developed version of this, which I'm actually kind of okay with, because I'm kind of glad to be able to show you guys the earlier parts of the research process. Some of you guys are interested in grad school. Some of you guys are going to be doing kind of research projects later on, either to finish up your degrees and other things like that. So I'm kind of okay to be giving you guys like this rough version of that. But it also means that there are going to be things in there that you're going to be like, this may not make as much sense. And if that's the case, then that's totally fine. Then you can actually go out and say, when we talk about this in class, you can ask questions, give questions about it by all means, because it also, it's a bit of a selfish request as well, because that'll also improve the paper too. So I'll be putting up the version that I want you guys to read by next week of this here, because there are multiple different versions of the video game argument that I have, and the one that I want to give you guys here. So one of them is that video games act kind of like a social nexus and a social network, and that paper is pretty much fully polished. I presented it at the American Political Science Association's annual conference earlier this year, or not this year, last year. And so that's pretty well polished. It's about ready to be submitted for peer review and other things like that. It just needs a couple of small tweaks. But we've already talked about social capital, and so the idea that games kind of act as a nexus, as a place for social capital to develop, isn't really as much of the point that I'm going to be talking about here, which is, whether or not fictitious and fictional media can have effects on political behavior. And I do have that more fully fleshed out in the dissertation form than I do have as an article form, but unfortunately, the dissertation form of it is still a little incomplete and rough, and it's also 40 pages. I don't want you guys to have to read through 40 pages of that, and that's not even including the literature review or the things like that really get at the core theoretical ideas behind this. So we are going to be talking about today about partisan violence. Before we get into that, just a couple of short things. I was made aware recently. I'm not sure if this took into effect on Wednesday or if this came into effect on Thursday, but I became aware of it. I want to say Wednesday night or Thursday morning, early Thursday morning, that the university has moved to its satisfactory, unsatisfactory system, right? So as opposed to doing a pass-fail, because UF apparently doesn't like to use the PF letters. I don't know, but they have the satisfactory, unsatisfactory system where if you feel like you can switch your grade from this class to satisfactory, or unsatisfactory system if you so want. You have to submit that yourself. That does not have to be approved by me. Was I able to find out anything about signing up for the Election Data Sciences course? I found out, yeah. So I did find out that there actually is just in general some IT issues because of just the flood of individuals trying to register for courses for the fall. So I think that's part of the issue that's going on right there. I'm having a follow-up meeting because when I talked to them about that, they said they were going to talk to other people about that, but they had cited some of the things that they knew about it. Would I be willing to accept the written assignment for this week by Sunday? I mean, yeah, I would prefer it in as quickly as you can, as close as you can to the Friday deadline. And I'm not trying to just say that to be as in terms of like I'm trying to be a stickler for the rules to keep things the way they were and da. It's more just for my own sanity because I have to try to allot my time well. But I think that Sunday should be fine. I don't think I'll be getting too much grading done for that essay by then. So yeah, in general, just try to make sure. Yeah, no, I can appreciate that. I'm just trying to also just make sure that I have that. It's not so much that it's going to be about lowering or causing any kind of grade penalty. It's just more like, okay, is that going to fit in with my mental schedule? How is that fitting in with my mental schedule? In general, it's fine. You guys just try to get this to me, like I said, as close as you can to the Friday deadline as you can. But obviously, keep in mind the own situations and your own considerations going on in your own lives. They take higher priority than submitting an essay on time. And, just talk to me about the sort of things and we'll work something out. So for the election sciences course, there was a whole bunch of flood of people going in, so some IT issues, and then I'm having a follow-up meeting today to be able to talk about that and see if that's working. So I would say give it a go, and if it's still not working, let me know. And so that's what I would say about that. There should be that issue. Baby schedule, yeah, baby schedule is a thing, or lack of baby schedule is a thing. So going to talk a little bit about the satisfactory, unsatisfactory thing. I don't have to approve that. So if you want to do satisfactory or unsatisfactory system that is entirely by you, you submit that to the registrar. The registrar takes the grade that you earned from the class and then converts it to the satisfactory, unsatisfactory. Satisfactory is considered a C. It is not considered a C minus. So keep in mind that the dinosaur extra credit does go, right, it adds to both the denominator and the numerator. So if you haven't already submitted that dinosaur that I mentioned before, please go ahead and do that because that'll help make sure that those of you who are flirting on that line between C minus and C, that you're substantially over that line. And if you feel like that the satisfactory, unsatisfactory thing is what's best for you in terms of, your future career, your future goals and your future here at UF, please come talk to me about that. We'll talk about whether, you can by all means consult me about that. I'm not the one who makes that decision ultimately, but I'm more than happy to try to talk with you and, help you determine whether or not that's the best thing for you to do for your future and things like that. Could I talk about the final paper at some point today? Yeah, okay, so let's go ahead and talk about that real quick before the extra credit. Just send me a picture of it's another dinosaur picture kind of thing. Just send me a picture of a dinosaur to email or through Canvas, and that should work. So let's go ahead and look up at the syllabus and talk about the final exam. Or the final paper, rather. So the final paper is you'll take one of the 12 questions that we talked about throughout the semester, right? So the ones that are listed here in the syllabus, as well as the ones which are the same as the ones that have been on Canvas regarding your week, the assignments that are open every week for writing. So yeah, cool. LOL. Yeah, I'm not. It's a relatively easy extra credit assignment, and I like dinosaurs, so it helps. It works. So the paper will be due midnight, April 26th. Let me zoom in to make sure everyone can see that all right. Paper is due on the 26th. You're allowed to expand on a previously submitted writing assignment. but just don't basically copy paste what you did and then add new paragraphs into it, right? Like you can take the ideas that you had before, and hopefully the time that since you wrote that essay, as well as the feedback that I gave on those essays, hopefully you're able to incorporate that and make it and kind of expand it out and things like that. So you can do it on a topic that you previously hadn't written about before. But in general, I would recommend, especially right now with all the things being as hectic as they are, finding a topic that you did well at in terms of writing previously, and then writing and expanding upon that. So, the final paper is worth 200 points, 20% of the grade, 20% of the grade under the previous 1,000-point system, and it's between 5 to 8 pages. So it's it's a larger bit. It's expected to be a little bit more substantive and a little more in depth, right, than the 2 to 4 page responses, and that's because these questions that I gave you guys are kind of modeled off of the kinds of questions that we might get for our comprehensive exams, in the sense of, like, for the PhD, we get comprehensive exams after like 3.5 years in your studies, and those you get like long questions like those, and you're expected to give 8 to 10 page responses for those, and even then you feel like you're too cramped. So I gave you guys those knowing that it should give you more than enough to be able to talk about for 2 to 4 pages, while also feeling like, oh, there's more depth that I could go in here if I had either the time, the desire, or the space, right? So that's kind of what this is now you have more of that time, more of that space to be able to dig in to these ideas and really kind of flesh out your thoughts about this. Kind of let what you know about this come through. Let the things you've learned come through, but also try to let your individual thoughts on this come through as well. So that's due on Sunday, April 26th. I might extend the deadline in terms of Monday or Wednesday. I want to say it was Wednesday. Yeah, it was Wednesday. Was the last day to send the first draft to the final paper. I might extend that to the following Monday. Again, I have to just keep in mind that I have to continue doing these gradings and other things like that, and my other responsibilities, as well as baby, as well as baby. So okay, disconnected, reconnecting from OBS. Cool. That's nice. All right, OBS is now reconnected. There we go. Yeah. Drinking my coffee. All right, so I might extend the deadline so Wednesday is the last day that I had on here to Wednesday was the day that I had on here to extend have the deadline for when I would read that first draft of the paper. I'm considering extending it maybe to the following Monday or the following Wednesday, but keeping in mind that sped up then froze, so to me it was gibberish, lol. So I might extend that deadline for when I'll have that first draft review by maybe the following Wednesday. And wait, what am I extending? I'm extending the deadline for, so right now I have it as an option that if you want to send a first draft of your final paper to me just to make sure that you're on the right track, you can do that by I want to say that was April the 1st, Wednesday the 1st. I'm thinking about I'm probably going to extend that to at least the following Monday. So if you send me a first draft of your final paper, I can read over that, and I can tell you if you're on the right track, if you're going about it in the same direction, things like that. By extending it to that next week, though, I can't promise that for those who do submit it here or submit that draft there, that I'm going to be able to give you as much really in-depth feedback as I can for those who submit earlier. But long and the short of it is that, it's kind of like, you can submit it to me then, and I can tell you, like, hey, is this really kind of the, are you taking this idea, are you taking this in the right direction? Are you fleshing your ideas right? Are you supporting your ideas right? So that way you can get the best score possible for that. So you don't have to submit a draft. Yeah, so you don't have to submit a draft. It is entirely optional. That is something if you want to be able to do, you can do. And if you do decide that you want to do that, go ahead and try to get that to me by next Monday, next Wednesday. So yeah, that would be for that. So that's the final exam. Are there any? Well, not final exam. Final paper. I tried to take Ethan's advice and get some rest. Unfortunately, baby doesn't like the idea of her parents getting rest, and I've been pretty open about my personal mental health in the class before, right? Talking about anxiety and things like that, and it probably isn't a surprise to anybody that it's a bit high and burning and burdensome at the moment. So I'm trying my best, and so yeah, it's if I part of why I seem like I'm going off the track and having a hard time keeping things together is because it is a little harder to keep things together right now with mental health. I say that not to try to elicit sympathy or things like that, but to also just like normalize, because a large percentage of people have various different forms of mental health issues in this country, but we don't talk about that. We have no fear about talking about broken bones, but if there's something a little bit rattling, a couple of wires that aren't as connected as they should be in your brain, we don't talk about that for some reason. I like to try to actively dispel that stigma. But second, at least I'm trying. I appreciate that. But second, also, just to let you guys know that I know that you guys are feeling anxious. Right? So, I appreciate that, Ethan. Thank you. All right, so do we have any other questions about the final paper before we talk about today's lecture, which is Partisan Violence, which is going to be a little bit shorter because I made these with the idea that I would be answering questions you guys submitted on Monday, but obviously getting reading quizzes up has been a little harder. So this will be a little shorter of a class with that in mind. So before that, any questions you guys have about the final paper? OBS continues to disconnect. All right. Anyways, so questions. What questions do we have on the final paper? So let me just take a sip of coffee and let you guys answer that. What is OBS? I'll answer it now rather than answer it in the chat. OBS is open broadcasting software, or it's open broadcasting system. It's what I use, and actually what a lot of gamers and streamers use to stream to YouTube and to Twitch. So I'll put it over here real quick just to show you. And you'll get a nice infinite recursion down here. So this is the software that I use to be able to stream. It takes in different audio and visual data and allows it to kind of go all into one place. And I can switch between different scenes. So that's just my face. There's just the PowerPoint. There's face and the PowerPoint. And then there's the standby. Yeah. So open broadcasting. It's totally free too. And that's what I love about open broadcasting, about OBS, is that it's free to use and things like that. And it's a wonderful bit of software. Yeah, so no other questions about the essay? Which side is more violent in terms of partisan violence? Well, this is not a side thing. Madeline, did I say that I was... Okay. You say you're extending the due date of it. Sorry, my computer froze. And then action on the writing in general. When will we get our feedback from week 10? Week 10 was the one that was the last assignment. You should be getting your feedback from that today. So that should be done today. I've almost finished grading with that. So you guys should be getting that by the end of today, maybe Saturday. Yeah, so hopefully by today, early tomorrow at latest. What type of violence has the most impact socially? That's an excellent question. Excellent question. So, which side is more violence? And so Haley, what actually was meaning was like final. If we have any questions on like about the essay itself, but I hope I'll be able to answer that as we get into the lecture because those are excellent questions. And then I'm extending the due date. Madeline, no, I am not extending the due date of the essay itself. What I'm extending is the deadline for you to be able to send in the first draft if you so choose. Right. I can't really. There's no time for me to be able to extend the deadline of the paper itself, right? That's already kind of a bit of a crunch to have about 50 people sending in between 5 to 8 pages of stuff. So that's already a bit of a deadline and a crunch as it is. I wish I could extend it, but I just unfortunately can't. So, and then, like I said, for Ashton and everybody else, you should get your feedback on week 10 by today or tomorrow. So, all right, let's talk about partisan violence. Shorter lecture because... again, it was more constructed with the idea that there'll be questions at the end of it, but hopefully we'll be able to have questions at the end of this as well, just questions from you guys in the chat rather than anything else. Make sure that I'm streaming the right thing. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. So we talked about this week. Monday we talked about. Wednesday I stumbled through, but we talked about this week about the idea of violence and how aggressive rhetoric can lead to increased violence and things like that, and social violence. Right. And we know that political identities are, in fact, identities, and we know that increased violent rhetoric and aggressive rhetoric makes people more predisposed, or certain people more predisposed, to enact violence upon those with oppositional identities, so those that are seen in contrast with those identity. Oh, Madeline, no problem. I appear to have blacked out for a second. Okay, I'm back. All right. So we know that violence and aggressive rhetoric can make us more likely to endorse violence, right? Especially with those who are with an identity that is seen as in contrast to one of our own. We know that partisanship is increasingly salient, right? Because of the sorting, we know that that one's partisan identity often is often kind of at least emotionally attached, if not psychologically attached, to a variety of other very, very important identities for us. So partisanship is increasingly salient, and it's also increasingly being framed in combative terms, right? We know that it's been long that aggressive, violent, and warlike rhetoric is long featured in the American political system. So its usage isn't new. Its increased frequency is, however, right? And the increased almost alacrity, right? Like the excitement and the enthusiasm with which we use this language. It's not unique in American history, but it is at a relative high. It is at a local maxima, and that maxima tends to increase. So with that, we have to be able to acknowledge that there is then a danger to causing an increase in or an increased normalization of partisan violence as well, right? So we're going to talk about partisan violence. We're going to talk about it in different contexts, and then we're going to talk about it at least briefly about what we can do as citizens to try to stem it a little bit, to try to reduce it, because speaking from both a mix of professional and personal opinion here, if there is not just a symbol but also a cause that worries me the most about the United States' long-term trajectory, it's the increased enthusiasm and increased willingness that we are able that we are willing to dehumanize the partisan other, right, and to increasingly endorse negative outcomes upon the partisan other, right. That's not something that is natural, right? We've talked about how group identities that outgroup biases only tend to come in zero-sum games, but even then, outgroup biases does not necessarily have to mean virulence, does not have to necessarily mean venom, right? Those are things that are encouraged by various systems, informal, in our society right now, various structures in our society right now, but those don't have to be the case, right? So what can we do to stem that and to try to preempt, again, what I both from a mix of personal and professional opinion feel to be one of the country's greater existential issues, right? So let's talk about partisan violence elsewhere to be able to get a context for this, right? So in some places, it's not like the United States is alone in having partisan violence, and not by a long shot, right? So let's just kind of talk about how this stuff gets structured elsewhere. So some places, authoritarian regimes in general, although not exclusively, they will stoke political violence near election periods or at other periods of time to be able to ensure competition and be able to control competition. And that's kind of an important thing in general when we're talking about electoral authoritarianism or electoral systems around the world, because a lot of places have quote-unquote elections. So authoritarian governments don't work like just by having a king and saying, we're not going to have any elections, we're not going to have any of this, we're not going to have any of that. They often hold to the pretenses of electoral democracy, right? Like North Korea has elections. It just so happens that there's only one candidate on the ballot and the turnout is compulsory, right? And deviation is severely punished. But they at least have the trapping of the democratic system, and that is very common across various autocracies. So the thing about autocracies and electoral autocracies and limited competitive environments is that it's exactly that. It's limited competition, and the limits to that competition are controlled by the main actor and their associated power brokers, right? So that's something to keep in mind, that autocracy now is not like an absence of elections or not an absence of the illusion of civic engagement and input and direct civic input. It's the ability to control that input such that it doesn't map onto real systemic change, that it continues to allow these individuals to stay in power. It's controlled competition towards their favor. Okay. Violence is not only enacted by the state, but through informal groups associated, often loosely, with the state itself, and this is to add plausible deniability. So you guys remember Hong Kong protests, right? Which, as an aside, I personally love, just for one small example in terms of the video game thing, because with Mei, if you guys play Overwatch, Mei is a Chinese character that Blizzard made for Overwatch, and she actually became a small symbol of the Hong Kong protests because of Blizzard's kind of callousness towards the Hong Kong protests and their active censorship efforts in terms of some of their servers and some of their activities in general. So they used the symbol of the video game company, or a symbol of the video game company, against them and for like pro-democracy protests, which is fantastic. I just love that little example. But in general, with the Hong Kong protests, you guys might remember that especially earlier on, although not exclusively earlier on, there was a lot of violence being enacted against the protesters. Now, the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government have moved to using police, like actual state police, to enact that violence. But initially, right back when they weren't able to frame this as a disruption to public order, they didn't use that. But violence was still enacted upon the protesters, but it was done through organized crime, right? So a lot of crime families were actually enacting violence against the protesters, the pro-democracy protesters. But these violent organized crime individuals have strong ties to the Chinese government. So it happens like that. There are groups that are informal that will act upon the will of the state, either directly or not, with some subtle nudges and winks, to be able to engage in partisan violence, right? So to engage in violence that will suppress these sorts of things. So that's something that happens. We also know that violence tends to increase around election time in general, just because it's due to the increased salience of that political identity, right? It's as salient as it is now in terms of, like, in the past it might be like this salient and now it's this salient. Election time is like this salient, right? It increases because of the increased information that's available, because elections make you feel like you have increased stakes, so things feel like they're higher, they're more tense and things like that, so people are more likely to engage in those violent behavioral scripts, and that causes an increase of violence around elections in general in both democracies and autocracies. I was trying to say autocratic. That's the word. Autocratic systems, right? Controlling even for the use of selective use of violence in autocracies. That you still see that increase around election time. And a good case of that, actually, to be able to kind of get a sense of like how that might happen, in terms of that, is to think back on the Catalonian referendum, right? So you had that. For one, you had the state enacting violence because they thought that, you had the state, actually, the police enacting violence upon the individuals trying to vote for Catalonian separation, because the state saw that as an illegitimate vote, and they were trying to make sure that Catalonia does not separate or does not declare its independence. So you actually saw police out in force and engaging in violence, but you also saw violence in general being enacted by the individuals who wanted this separation, as well as individuals who didn't want this violence, because it was right by the time. Like, there was no time more salient for increased Catalonian separation, at least again in terms of maximum local time. Local time frames. We're not talking about like hundreds of years ago or even decades ago or anything like that. Like in terms of like just local, feeling and things like that. There really haven't been feelings of raised stakes like that. So they were engaging in acts of violence, or minorities were engaging in acts of violence because of that increased salience and because of that increased feeling of like, okay, shit is getting real, things are on the line. So we know those are kind of when those sorts of things, or at least a few of the conditions where these sorts of things happen. It's obviously not an all-encompassing list. Again, this is something that you can spend entire careers studying. And it's not like the United States is immune, because we've definitely had partisan violence in the country before, right? We have definitely shed blood for the sake of partisanship. Partially because, again, partisanship had been sorted into other salient identities and other salient social issues, but it was still done on partisan lines, right? So we can talk about a few of these examples, right? You have Bleeding Kansas, where you would have, this was back when they were trying to determine whether or not Kansas would enter the Union as a slave state or as a free state, and you would have individuals crossing over the borders to be able to engage in election fraud. You would have to say that they were voting as a citizen of Kansas when they actually were maybe like a citizen of Nebraska or something like that, or the Nebraska Territory, or other parts of that general area. They weren't actually living in Kansas, but they would go in and they would engage in voter fraud. And if that was all that they did, at least that would have been nonviolent. But no, as this picture right here demonstrates, there was a lot of bloodshed. There were battles. There were thousands of people who were shot, killed, and died, appropriately labeled Bleeding Kansas. Right? There was a reason why it was called that, over the issue of whether or not Kansas would enter the country as a slave state or not. And this was done based off of, the violence was being enacted by one partisan group. In one case, either the abolitionists or the individuals who were trying to enact slavery in the territory versus the other group, right? Because those were the local partisan camps. Like those were the electoral factions that existed there that were salient in those countries. So that was an example of partisan violence. North Carolina actually had a coup. There was actually a coup that occurred around after the Civil War, in terms of, I think might have been after Reconstruction. I can't remember if it was during the period of Reconstruction. I want to say it was after Reconstruction. It was after the federal forces left, and I want to say it was North, not South Carolina, one of the Carolinas. And you had the legitimately elected government that happened there, and then the other group was like like very proudly white supremacist, and they basically stormed the Capitol and seized control of the state government. And again, this is right a little after the time of Reconstruction. So that happened. The Civil War, obviously, like the maximal, as Calmo and Mason describe in their article, like that is maximal amounts of partisan violence that can happen in this country. That is literally people engaging in warfare for the purposes of partisanship. Again, it's not mere partisanship, because it's not like parties existed without other salient issues and identities being included in there. There absolutely was, especially right in the case of the Civil War. But it was still an example that could be categorized into partisan violence. And then you also have just the uncountably large number of instances where people would go to the polls and intimidate people away from voting, where you had the Southern Democrats in the South during that period of subnational authoritarianism, right, that existed from, post-Reconstruction up through the 1950s, 1960s, right? And even in some localities, even beyond, right, thinking about the period of Jim Crow, thinking about segregation, things like that. But during that period of subnational authoritarianism, you had individuals who would go to polling booths and they would basically bully. You had the Southern Democrats that would threaten African Americans from voting. They would threaten Republicans from voting. They would keep them away from the polls. And that was actually considered a long time to be like one of the jobs of like the polling of the people who were, of the poll workers, right? Poll workers were extremely partisan officials back then. We now think of poll workers when we go there as like, local members of one organization or another, like, someone's grandmother or grandfather, someone who has just time to be able to donate and go in and just like help the civic process. Nah, they were extremely partisan officials back, not too terribly long ago, back like, 50, 60 years ago, and then going obviously back to that period of subnational authoritarianism. They were extremely partisan actors, and they would coordinate with informal groups to prevent people from voting, because the machine era had instances of like vote stuffing, of people voting multiple times, those sorts of vote fraud, but that wasn't really the form of electoral control that the South engaged in, right? Again, we're talking about controlled competition rather than actual preclusion of voting, right? So what happened was is that the ballots would be counted correctly. It's just that African Americans and opposite partisans weren't allowed to vote. They were physically precluded from being able to vote. So partisan violence was used in those senses to be able to ensure that Southern Democrats would maintain their power. And then it wasn't necessarily just foisted against Southern Republicans and foisted against African Americans. That was considered to be a form of normal politics and normal political processes for quite a while against other parties as well, or against Democrats as well in the North. So it wasn't just a thing that only happened in the South, right? And that's also just an important thing to keep in mind, right? We often focus and hone in on the travesties and the absolute terribleness of racism and slavery in the South, and we absolutely should not lose focus on that in any sort of regard. But there's an old saying, right, that Northerners will not stand for racism in the South. We too often forget the many instances of race related violence and things like that happened, and racial violence and racial prejudice and things that happened in the North, such as the burning of Wall Street and things like that. So we have to, not lose focus, but also expand that focus here. The South, in many ways, is unique, but in some very unfortunate cases, it's not. And there are obviously multiple forms of politically targeted violence that would happen. And so you can think of things like lynching and other things like that being examples of politically targeted violence, and those obviously that happened for a very long time in this country. So let's talk about moral disengagement theory. And here we go. Here's that quote that I mentioned last time, because we've been binging Westworld, because what else are you going to do? we're fully caught up. So, and you guys who also watch Westworld, this is for y'all. So one of the mechanisms that goes on with the instances of partisan violence, which Mason and Camo worry that it is increasingly likely to occur or to break out today. One of the big mechanisms for that was something that was formulated initially by Arthur Bandura. That's called the moral disengagement theory. You might recognize Bandura from a whole bunch of different psychological studies. If you guys remember, those of you who have studied psychology in any regard, you might recognize his name from the Bobo the Clown experiment, where he had children watch violent stimuli, and then went to go see how many, and then provided them this inflatable clown called Bobo the Clown. And went to see how many of the children would physically enact violence amongst this inflatable clown. And those who saw a violent act or saw adults acting violently were more likely to hit the clown versus those who did not witness a violent stimuli. Those sorts of findings got included into the general aggression model that we talked about on Wednesday. So yeah, it also just kind of shows, that studies like that are a product of its time, because nowadays, thanks to Stephen King, right, thanks to it and Pennywise, I'm pretty sure just about any sensible person would see the inflatable cloud and punch somebody square in the face. I heard Westworld got bad. No, okay, so Westworld got really, really good, but it also got very cerebral, and there are times where it almost gets like Matrix 2E or Matrix 3E, in that it kind of starts dipping into it starts getting its own supply, right? It starts getting high off its own supply. Like, it knows that it's a smarter show. It knows that it's meant to be confusing, right? I think that an appropriate analog for those who might be who are interested in things like that, like Lost is probably an appropriate analog. So is BioShock Infinite is an appropriate analog, because it's confusing. You don't always know at what time you're dealing with things, and you don't know the nature of reality necessarily when you're dealing with this at all times. But it really, from a literary perspective especially, it's just so fantastically well executed, because even though you have all these unreliable moments in terms of, is this real, is this not, unreliable narrators and actors and things like that, you still feel engrossed in what's going on there. So from a technical perspective and from a storytelling perspective, it is absolutely well done. It's very well done. I don't want to say it has changed, and it has become a little more complicated. I could go on for a while about Westworld. It's a very, very well executed show. So one of these days, I'm just going to have a politics of fiction class, and I'll be able to actually just go off on these tangents, and that tangent will be the class, and my life will be complete. But moral disengagement theory is this idea that basically tries to talk about why we let ourselves as a society and as a culture feel that the other is the other and subhuman, and if not, allow. The headline I read was, not even Aaron Paul can save Westworld from itself. Oof. Aaron Paul did a great job. No, I don't know. So far, I'm enjoying the latest season. For sure, seasons 1 and 2 are fantastic. Season 3 is a little different and rocky because, it's no longer the same. But it's, I don't know. It's still good. So, moral disengagement theory is, it's this thing that kind of lets us try to understand and wrap our head around not only why we allow the other to be demonetized and violence to be enacted upon them, but why we might encourage that or to feel that it's a morally good thing. This theory was really coming into the fore as people were trying to grapple with the atrocities of things like the Holocaust, right? And but unfortunately, right, we hear echoes, and so moral disengagement theory plays into, like, when we see things in Darfur, when we see things like what's going on with the Uyghurs in China, when we see what's going on in India with the Muslim minority there, the Christian minority in Burkina Faso. Although in Burkina Faso, right, it's important to mention that that's not the state enacting that, right? That is civil violence, but at the same time, why we see this dehumanization process occur, right? So it's a prevalent social and psychological phenomenon or theory that explains events like these, right? And there are a number of different mechanisms for how we become morally disengaged, right? And these don't work in a nice, clean, linear fashion, like, oh, first you have moral justification, then euphemistic labeling, and da-da-da-da-da. Like, no, this is a system of factors that coalesce in very complicated ways. And that is what makes it complicated to be able to stop, because if it was a clean, linear system, like if this was somehow like analogous to a conveyor belt, you could just block some part of the chain, you could just stop the belt at some point, and then you would no longer have that end result. But the problem is that it's more like an organic network, and if you try to stop or tamper down one thing, then something else can replace it or accommodate its absence. And once the system goes, it is very adaptable and very difficult to be able to stop, which is why it's important to stop it before it starts. All right, so let's talk about these different ways be able to that it kind of tends to occur. So first is, first that we talk about is moral justification, which is the ability for us to stop, like, so we'll enact acts. So the idea for the moral justification is that people will say or do things that they know to be reproachable, that they know to be wrong, and they might begin to self-censure a little bit when it happens, but as part of rationalization, because our brains don't like to think of ourselves as being bad people, right? Going back to Westworld, if you can think about the character with I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but the black hat and things like that, who does absolutely terrible things and horrible things to all the different hosts in the show. He mentions in one part of season 2 that he's like, I'm a good person outside the park. I do charity. I do this. I do that. There's this idea that no one likes to think of themselves as being the villain. No one likes to think of themselves as being a bad person. So what our brains will do as we repeatedly do small micro actions against individuals, we'll start to create moral justifications for why they're seen as subhuman, right? You can think about that moral justification, right, when we think about back to race making, right, in terms of racial identities, about how moral justifications were used to be able to justify the system of slavery that we had in the United States, right? So that's part of that. You can think of that as kind of being analogous, that you had moral belief systems that would start to adapt and start to be able to rationalize away the atrocities that are being committed. You have euphemistic labeling, which is basically it's a linguistic pattern, it's a rhetorical pattern of referring to people in a way that diminishes their humanity, right? That diminishes their claim to either personhood or to full status of rights that personhood would have in that particular society. You have advantageous comparisons, which is something that happens all too frequently now, right? Where someone says, oh, well, this bit of violence is terrible, but what about when it happened here? Or how about when it happened here? Or how about when it happened here? How about this? Or how about that? Like the whataboutism. And what that does is it tries to frame that negative thing in such a way that it either seems not to be so large, right? Or it actually may be perversely good, ultimately, right? You have displacement and diffusion of responsibility, which is something where people will be like, it's not my fault, it's this thing's fault, or it's not. You basically becomes like it's no one's fault that this happens, and because it's no one's fault that this happens, no one steps up, and nothing ever happens in terms of stemming the tide of the negativity and the deleteriousness. Then you have the disregarding or misrepresenting of the injurious consequences. One place where you might see this nowadays, as an example, is you had a minority of people on the right, and I want to emphasize that this was a minority of people on the right, who, when President Trump started enacting the policy to have the children separated from their families at the southern border, a minority of individual, like most people across the political spectrum, recognized that was a not ideal situation. So again, I'm trying to remind that this is a farther contingent, right? A more extreme contingent. Most people recognize that that's not an ideal scenario for anyone involved, for any one of the kids and things like that, that can cause psychological damage and things like that. And most people are open to the idea of trying to minimize that harm and minimize that damage. And individuals on the right are open to the idea of minimizing the harm to the children, minimizing the damage that could happen psychologically and things like that, while also maintaining fidelity to the laws of the country and maintaining a stronger border. Individuals on the left obviously have the preference to be, or the preference there is more about the immediate relief from the conditions that the children were in, which were definitely not great. Definitely not. There were laws that prevented them from being in the exact same conditions that they were in, or at least agreements that were in the exact same conditions that they were in. So you had this general broad agreement that things weren't ideal, but you did have this minority on the farther right who would basically be like, oh, it's effectively a summer camp. Like, there were people who legitimately said that these kids being away from their parents in these conditions was no worse than a summer camp. And what that is that's disregarding and misrepresenting the injuriousness of the situation and the consequences of that situation, right? So you have individuals who did things like that. And then you have outright dehumanization, which is to call people rats, which is to call them demons, which is to call them things that, again, when you start to associate linguistically, becomes part of that network, cognitive network, part of that conceptual network that makes us more likely to feel that it's justifiable that violence is enacted upon them. And we're not so far gone yet. Is displacement and diffusion similar to the bystander effect? It feeds into the bystander effect. You know, the bystander effect is a little different in that the bystander effect, as it's generally conceptualized, is that the bystander effect is more likely to occur when there are multiple other people around the incident. And what happens, again, theoretically, is it's less of, I don't have any responsibility here. It's, oh, I assume that other people are going to do something, or I assume that someone has already done something, or I assume, that, but by virtue of there being so many other people who are witnessing the event, the bystander effect is that I don't have to act myself, right? Not necessarily that it's not my responsibility, but it's not, I don't need to, someone else will, right? Someone else will pick up that slack, or someone else has already picked up that slack. Whereas displacement and diffusion of blame is explicitly like, I have done this negative thing, but it's not my fault this negative thing has caused these negative consequences, or it's not actually the removal of blame. But there is, right, obviously a harmony there. There is a similarity there. And if there's a conclusion to be drawn from the fact that there is a harmony there, it's that, again, to quote Mr. Rogers, look for the helpers, and when you can, try to be one of the helpers. You can't, especially with regard to the bystander effect, you can't just assume that somebody is going to be able to stop and be able to help, right? Sometimes you just have to, if you can, make sure that you are able to do that yourself. I see ... from Ethan. I'm going to pause a second to let him elaborate. I'm going to pause a second to let him elaborate so I can answer. It looks like there might be a question. I'm just going to pause so I can see if I can answer the question. Actually, while he writes that, I want to be able to kind of provide a motivating example for what is concerning me about something that's happening right now. So, again, we all know about COVID-19, understatement of the century. So we all know about this, and what's happening right now is that there's concerns, and it is becoming increasingly realized concerns, that reactions to the disease are increasingly partisan, right? So if you look at the way that different news organizations are treating this, and Pew recently released some data that a lot of political scientists and social scientists have been analyzing to show a strong correspondence, that those in Republican circles watching Fox News and associated channels like that are taking the disease less seriously than those who watch other channels and those who are not in those media environments. And so people were concerned that, that this was going to become kind of a partisan thing. This was going to asymmetrically negatively impact people. I was making comment on the previous slide. What was the comment on the previous slide? Just so I can understand it, because there's such a delay. I'm not sure what was being talked about. So the people were concerned that this is going to have an asymmetry, not just in terms of seriousness, but ultimately in terms of effect, right? So if you have a virus that, I promise, does not distinguish or differentiate between partisans, right? It does not care if you are young or old. What matters to it is that you have a healthy respiratory system that it can replicate itself in, and that it can hijack your cells to be able to do that. It does not care if those are Democratic cells or Republican cells, right? It will do it. But if there's a group of individuals who are taking it more seriously and trying to engage in the social distancing to prevent themselves from doing it, while other groups see social distancing as something that should be less serious, or something that isn't necessary, or anything else like that, that the disease is fake, or that the disease is just, hyperbole, or that the effects of the disease are just hyperbole, then there's a chance that those individuals, right, forget about it. All right. That those individuals who are taking the disease less seriously are going to be more likely to ultimately contract it, right? So there is concern among a number of political scientists. Sorry, just wiping away something on the screen. There's concern among political scientists and concern among those who are public health specialists that because the media environment for a lot of Republicans are telling people to not take this disease as seriously, that you have like Republican governors who at one point said, go out to your local restaurants, go out and do these things like that. Like, it's fine. Go support local businesses by physically being there. Time out. By all means, support local businesses, especially if they're restaurants. Like, support them as much as you can, but like, take out, please. Like, for your own health, take out the food. Don't sit in the actual restaurant. I mean, I don't think you can in Alachua County anymore, but just in general, regardless of where you guys are. Support your local businesses as best as you can, but don't endanger your own self by doing that. So people are concerned that there's going to be an asymmetric effect, that Republicans are ultimately going to face a larger death count than Democrats will, especially because Republicans tend to be a little bit older. So that's concerning, right? That's bad. We don't want anybody to be dying of this disease. We don't want anybody to be feeling that it's not. We don't want unnecessary deaths, right? We don't want people to be taking this insufficiently serious and then ultimately perish because of that. However, if you look at social media, if you look on Twitter, if you look on Facebook, if you look on Reddit, you will find people who say something to the effect of, well, the GOP are getting what they deserve. Or, well, if the GOP and Republicans in the electorate are getting this sickness, that means that, there will be fewer people to stop us from being able to enact better healthcare, or stop us from being able to enact this and be able to enact that. Like, I'm not isolating. I'm not cherry picking. There are entire threads of people who are making those sorts of claims, and that's terrible, right? I don't know. That doesn't need to be said. It's sad that it needs to be said, but it's atrocious to sit back and say that that's anything other than tragic. That the way that the media system had been constructed, that there's going to be a group of people who are asymmetrically affected by this, and that it's ultimately going to be a good thing for the country, or ultimately going to be a good thing for people, that they perish, right? But the fact that we're seeing that rhetoric really just shows how bad we're at right now, and how likely it is, or not how likely it is, but how much of a danger it is, right? This could go further. So we're not so far gone yet. Let's kind of, with that as the backdrop, let's talk about this a little bit. Let's talk about why we're not so far gone. We're not so far gone because most people are far more permissive of lower acts of violence towards the outgroup, right? I know, Ethan, I'm sorry. I ran over. And for anybody else who has to run because I ran over on time, I sincerely apologize. It's keeping track of time is hard. But yeah, so if you have to go, please go. Don't forget to sign in the attendance and things like that. But we're not so far gone. Most people are far more permissive of lower acts of violence towards the outgroup than more serious acts of violence. And in general, it hasn't gone to Schadenfreude, right? It hasn't gotten to the point where people are taking joy in other people perishing, or taking joy in other people getting sick, or taking joy in other people, or the other party Why do you think that people have gotten a bit of a boost in the polls, rally behind the flag effect? Yeah, I think that to pause the slide conversation to answer Jacob's question, yes, I think part of it is a rally around the flag. I think that part of it is because he's getting a lot of screen time on major networks and a lot of time, a lot of uncritical time in terms of the press that are basically taking his tweets, taking his statements, and just kind of uncritically boosting them, right? It also comes with some of the poll wording, right? I noticed that there was one poll, for instance, that was worded in the way of like the president had declared a state of emergency about this. Do you approve, disapprove, da 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 da? Like, not everyone is fully aware of. Not everyone is fully aware that the president called the virus a hoax back in February. Not everyone is aware that he said, like, once 15 individuals were sick with the disease, that it would just magically go away at some point. He was not saying that it was just going to disappear. Right? Not everyone is actually fully aware of this sort of thing because of the asymmetries in our media environment. Right? Fox News was not very keen on presenting those sorts of things, whereas other outlets that are critical of the president are obviously biting at the bit to be able to present those things. So it's a bit of a rally around the flag effect, which is being facilitated by the fact that the press is uncritically accepting the framing of this being a battle, this being a war, which again activates those cognitive concepts that are in favor of the president. If you think of the two president hypotheses, one for foreign policy, one for domestic policy. So the rally around the flag is part of it, but I think the rally around the flag is being boosted by the fact that there is still a lack of complete information about this, and a lot of people still haven't felt the effects of the virus directly themselves yet. People are dying because of the virus, but not that many people yet know somebody who has faced serious health repercussions because of the virus. Unfortunately, the medical professionals say that while our efforts at social distancing is helping reduce the severity of the virus, right? So they're talking about how it's easier to not easier, but that how there's going to ultimately be fewer deaths in this country because everyone is being responsible, or because so many people are being responsible. It doesn't, but we're still not at the worst of it yet. The curve is flattening, but we're not at the worst of it yet. So because of that, most people haven't felt the direct ramifications of that, and because of that, the president isn't facing a lot of the critical issues of that yet. Realistically, though, because he's going to be taking a lot of credit for the big stimulus package that passed recently and that will be signed by him very shortly, I think that the rally around the flag effect is going to be more stable than a lot of other political scientists are thinking. A lot of political scientists say that it's going to erode, that's going to be going away relatively soon once the reality sets in. But I think that they moved sufficiently swiftly enough that reality won't set in for longer, and perhaps so long as to avoid many negative health repercussions, provided that enough of the country actually engages in the CDC's recommended stuff. So long answer to that, because it's a really complicated thing, and it's a really good question ultimately. Going back over here real quick with the last final point to bring this up, we can help it by shutting it down, right? When we see it among co-partisans, right? So if you lean Democrat and you see somebody who says it's okay if this virus is affecting people on the right asymmetrically because they deserve it, right? Shut that shit down, right? Just straight up to say, look, as a fellow Democrat, that's abhorrent, right? Because we know from communications literature that a message coming from somebody of the in-group telling them to stop doing that action, especially if enough individuals are telling them, right, that gets them to stop promoting that action in the future, right? So shut that shit down, right? If you're a Republican, or if you're conservative and you see people who say, oh, look, the virus is only really affecting large cities and cities of critical density, and look, it's really just affecting Democrats. This is a Democratic disease. It's affecting them, and it's ultimately a good thing that it is because blah, 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 blah. Shut that shit down, right? Just shut it down. Tell them, like, look, as a Republican, as a conservative, it's bad when anybody in this country dies. It's bad when any American dies a preventable death, right? Again, the virus doesn't discriminate based off of Democrat and Republican. So don't say that sort of shit. So for one, I'd like to believe, and I know you guys well enough to know that that you guys are compassionate people. You guys are good people, and I am pretty confident that none of you guys have directly endorsed or used this sort of language yourself. But when you see it, regardless of what political camp you fall in, shut that shit down. Seriously. Because it's a serious issue in that it can only exacerbate that complex system that promotes the moral disengagement that could ultimately be a far bigger threat to this country than perhaps even COVID itself. So that's all that I have prepared for you guys here. Do you guys have any questions or anything else like that before I sign off? So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to go and post and log in and things like that, or post that stuff in the chat. And I hope, and that's the group chat that, how do they go for just like constantly? I mean, like it's even active at night, like early in the morning. I just might need to leave this group. All right, there we go. That should be fixed. Have my coffee. Oh, slides for today will be up very shortly onto e-learning, and I'll be posting the article that I want you guys to read pretty quickly as well. Yeah. Oh, just checking the chat over there real quick. All right. Gonna give it another few seconds before. Just to make sure that you guys have got an opportunity to ask any questions if you have any. Was there a reading quiz today? No, there was not. And that actually is an annoyance of mine because I stayed up really late on Wednesday to post it and then I didn't save the damn thing. So there was going to be a reading quiz today, but I didn't click save and submit. So no, there was no reading quiz today. I'll just also put that in the chat so you don't have to wait like an extra minute to have the answer. There was supposed to be ... but I didn't click publish/save like a goof. All right. Just ask in the chat real quick since it seems to be faster. All right. Alrighty, let me just put this in the chat then. Seeing none.